This webinar is made possible by the Sentio Marriage and Family Therapy Program. Visit us at www.sentio.org.
Hello and welcome to another Sentio webinar. I'm very excited to be hosting today. My name is Jason Brand and I'm a senior deliberate practice instructor at Sentio. Today we are taking another deep dive into the American Psychological Association's book series, Essentials of Psychotherapy, and we are going to be looking at psychodynamic psychotherapy. Another round in this with our esteemed guest, expert, Hannah Levinson. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you, Jason.
Let me tell you a little bit about Hannah. Hannah is a professor emeritus at the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. She has specialized in brief dynamic psychotherapy for over 40 years. She's published over 85, that's right, 85 professional papers, and has written 6 books. 3 are on deliberate practice, and the first of which we're covering today. Soon to be published is her 2 coming books within this series, AEDP and Emotionally Focused Couples Therapy, which I think are going to be coming out in the next 3 to 6 months. Does that sound about right?
Right. Hopefully February.
Great. So excited for those. Again, welcome, Hannah. How you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to be with you. It's a beautiful day here.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at fantasy. Cool. Okay, so real quick, lots of cool things happening at Sentio. They have a counseling center, which is currently accepting new clients. Fees started around $30. So really good low-fee referral source for California and Washington. You can see the websites there. Jot that down if you're in California and Washington and you have low-fee referrals. In addition, Sentio offers a year-long deep dive into some of the stuff we're going to be learning about today. And so this is their deliberate practice supervision residency. I went through it. I completed it. Hannah was a participant, sort of teacher in our group. It's a great experience. I can't say enough. If you want a deep dive, if you're in California or you're in Washington and you want to do a deep dive into deliberate practice and learn this model, there's no better way to do it. So that is the supervision residency program. So before we dive in here, we'd like to do a little bit to kind of set the stage. This is going to be our only conceptual piece today. We're going to get into an actual procedural learning activity in just a minute. But let me tell you a little bit about kind of the way that we frame deliberate practice and why we think it's important. So in deliberate practice, we like to make the distinction between conceptual learning and procedural learning. And conceptual learning is the kind of learning that you do if you're writing a paper, if you're talking to a colleague, even if you're going to supervision, and oftentimes even sort of, if you're doing a role play, that can be conceptual in that it's you're thinking about it, and it's not as much actually doing a specific skill where you are really learning, okay, this is the skill that I'm focused on and practicing that skill. So that is procedural learning. Procedural learning is learning by doing. And so as you can see from the picture here, there's one thing, you can study the history of great piano players. You can learn all about how the instrument makes music, but there's something very different about the actual playing of the piano and actual practice of the piano. And Hannah, you've had a wonderful little that you used to hate piano lessons. I've heard you talk about this. But can you say a little?
Yeah, and sometimes, people hate doing deliberate practice, because you're just on that edge of where you're learning something new, but it's frustrating. And so there is a tendency to avoid, right? There is a tendency to avoid going forward. But we're hoping that, with the way these deliberate practice exercises have been constructed, and then other options we can talk about, to really invite the psychotherapy community to get involved.
Yeah, exactly. And so great. So that's the difference between conceptual and procedural learning. And all of this has been captured in this book series, The Essentials of Psychotherapy Deliberate Practice book series, again, published by the American Psychological Association. And I think there's like 20 books now in the series. And each book is comprised of 12 exercises. And we're going to actually take a look at, you can see psychotherapy, psychodynamic psychotherapy. The complexity is captured in that picture on the cover there. And we can see what are the 12 exercises that are in the deliberate practice psychodynamic psychotherapy. You can see them there. And Hannah and her co-authors, Volney Gay and Jeff Binder, they sat down and they had this Herculean task of taking 12 of taking psychodynamic psychotherapy and putting it into 12 exercises. How'd you do that, Hannah? What was that? What was that like?
Well, there were many, many conversations and much, toing and froing about what would be these 12 exercises. We were limited to 12 by the structure of the books, but we came to these because I think they nicely exemplify the essential skills of a contemporary psychodynamic interpersonal approach.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you had a lot of emails. Did you guys have fun doing it? What was the process like? I mean, just can you give us sort of an insider's view into what this was like to do this?
Well, once we had identified the critical skills that we thought would exemplify, as I say, this contemporary relational psychodynamic approach, then we needed to figure out what criteria could we come up with to explicitly define each of these skills. It's one thing to talk about like using metaphors, and people may have very different ideas about how to do that in therapy. But what we needed to do was really explicate concrete behavioral interventions that could be used. And when you did those specific criteria, we could say you were using metaphors, for example.
Yeah. And I think that's where this is, revolutionary in terms of the way that we learn, which is we take these big concepts and then you guys had this amazing task, which was actually breaking it down. And we're going to see this in just a minute with today's exercise, which is going to be exploring fantasy. But you guys had to actually take something as big as fantasy, exploring fantasy and psychotherapy, and break it down into its criteria or components. So we're going to get to that in just a minute. We're actually going to look at what that criteria is, and then get to play around with some of this material. But before we go there, I do want to start it. I mean, fantasy could be a lot of things, Hannah, and so I want to know, can you just help us kind of put us in the ballpark in terms of what are you talking about? What were you and your co-authors talking about when you thought about fantasy material in and exploring fantasy in psychotherapy?
Right, and there could be many definitions of this as well. So some of these are, kind of an agreement among researchers, among theoreticians, among ourselves as the authors of this book. And what we decided to focus on were fantasies that were kind of on the edge of conscious awareness. And we were defining fantasy as an imagined fulfillment of a frustrated wish. So how does one imagine, right? You could fulfill a frustrated wish. And sometimes these wishes were very conscious, as I'm saying, on the part of the person being portrayed, but sometimes they could be below levels of consciousness, preconscious, even unconscious. And of course, the really complex ways to use fantasy and to do a deliberate practice around fantasy would be cases where those fantasies are confusingly expressed, not really conscious, the person is not psychologically minded, and then ferreting out those kinds of fantasies. As I say, in this deliberate practice exercise, on that continuum from conscious to unconscious, we veered more toward the conscious, because these exercises are really designed to help out the beginning practitioner.
Yeah. And we had an interesting conversation. I'll be curious if people just kind of tag that in your minds as you're watching this, because I found them actually this question between how implicit and explicit are they? I actually found I found some of them to be kind of hard to tease out the fantasy, and that's one of the reasons why I found this exercise in particular so helpful, is that it really, for me, I don't think that without deliberate practice, without practicing this and really kind of having an opportunity to explore it and in this way, I think it would have been hard to really identify the fantasies. But I'm curious, Hannah, do you have ideas about, why is this exercise, or even the exercises in general, why do they lend themselves well to deliberate practice?
Well, I think they lend themselves well to deliberate practice once one has gone through the task of identifying the criteria. And you may find once we get into our criteria for exploring fantasy, they may differ from yours, and that's fine. I think the essence is to make sure that you define the criteria in a way that you could tell if you're fulfilling them or not. That's the second one on, right? Can you say, once you've completed those criteria, yes, I have done this exercise. And that gives you the advantage of, when you're practicing, to realize where your weaknesses are. I mean, one of the things I really love about deliberate practice is it's what we call failure facing, which is to say, we're going for where you just start to fail in doing the exercise. Now, that's so atypical, where people tend to want to do things that they know how to do well over and over again. But here, we're really pushing the learner to go right to that edge where they don't quite grasp what to do. And then through rehearsal in a very deliberate way, you get to procedurally, behaviorally, automatically begin to adopt that skill and have it become part of your armamentarium when you're working with patients.
Yeah, so well said, Hannah. So well said. And so let's actually look at, so we've got this great definition that Hannah just brought of fantasy: imagined fulfillment of a frustrated wish. It's really wonderful. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the actual criteria of exploring fantasy. What do you do as a therapist when your client walks in and they have an imagined fulfillment of a frustrated wish? Within this criteria, what's the procedure that you follow?
Right.
Now, there are other procedures that you could follow. These are the ones that you and your co-authors came up with, and these are the ones that we're going to practice with today. So let's take a look at that. So, you want to read these, Hannah, or you want me to?
I can read them.
Okay, go ahead.
So here are our 3 skill criteria. And let me just say a little preface about 3 skill criteria. When we first started doing this, we had 4, 5, 6, 7, even 8 criteria for some of these skills. And that became an impossible cognitive burden for the person trying to learn them, just to keep all of those straight. And then if I finished with that one and, I left it. It was impossible. And so we put the onus on ourselves, and the editors helped us out with this, to get the criteria down to 1, 2, 3 doable behaviors.
Great. Okay. Well, let's let them rip. Let's see what you got.
All
What you
right.
came
So
up
the
with.
first one is to identify and name the conflict between the patient's present circumstances and what they ideally want. So identify and name the conflict. So you have to kind of envision that, name it, identify it. The second criterion is name the implicit or explicit fantasy for the client. And then the third is ask if the fantasy resolves the conflict.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Now, the way that this is done in the text, when you have the 12 exercises in front of you, is that you have either a person that you're working with, one other person, and you sit down and one person plays the therapist and the other person plays the client. And what we're going to show is an example. We're going to show an example of how that would look. Now, if you have a third person, which is great, which is a supervisor or a consultant, is that they can give feedback then on kind of how did the therapist and the client do, giving specific feedback to the therapist, so that either you have that supervisor there, or even if you have three trainees together, that one could be the one giving feedback based on the criteria, right?
Right.
But that would be too cumbersome for us to do today. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to do this in the chat, where we're going to give you a client prompt or a patient prompt, and then you all are going to have an opportunity to follow the criteria, put it into the chat box, and then we're going to be the supervisor, consultant, trainer here, and we're going to give feedback on what you guys have put together. So that's going to be the way we're going to do this today. Now, let's look at an example of a practice before we get into it here. Oh, and one more thing is that the great thing about the book is that Volney, Hannah, and Jeff put together sample responses. So you can know based on, oh, I was in the ballpark on this one, in terms of what you give as a response. All that sound clear, Hannah?
Yeah, let me just say, of course, there are as many acceptable responses that meet the criteria as there probably are therapists, right? So, but it does give you an idea about, oh, I see what they're going after. Oh, I am in the ballpark, rather than matching exactly like, oh, this is the right way.
Yeah.
Of course,
Yeah.
fortunately, we don't have that in our field.
Right. Great. And again, this gets at, we're not looking for cookie cutter responses here. We're looking for creativity and we're looking for play, really. And so that's the whole spirit of this exercise. So, Hannah, you ran through the criteria. I will be the client here, or the patient, and I would like you to, then you can read the therapist part. So the patient is a high school student and comes in and says to the therapist, I struggle with my schoolwork in class. Next thing I know is I'm on a lake in a canoe. It's so peaceful. Then the bell rings and the class is over.
All right, so criterion 1, you are struggling in school and wish it were easier. Criterion 2, and then you start daydreaming about being in a canoe where it is so peaceful instead of effortful. And criterion 3, did the peaceful canoe ride give you some relief from those classroom struggles? So just to be explicit, we have here identifying the conflict. You're struggling in school, wish it were easier. We're naming the fantasy, and then you start daydreaming where it is so peaceful instead of effortful. And then ask the patient, did that canoe ride give you some relief from those classroom struggles?
Great. Great. And I just love how clear this is. Okay, so get your digits ready here. What we're gonna do is I'm gonna flip the slide, and then you will get a patient cue here. You'll get a patient, what the patient says, and then we'll give you a minute to put in a response that matches the 3 criteria. And I'll give you some feedback on it. So away we go. So the patient is a 49-year-old father of 3 children who works as a grocery store clerk. And he comes in and he says, I'd like to have enough money to send my kids to college, but I just don't make enough at my job. So I've started buying 25 lottery tickets every week, and I'm feeling pretty lucky. I can just picture them in their caps and gowns and how happy they would be. All right, so I'll give you a minute to respond. Can we start with Tim up top there, right below the links?
Okay, I'm not sure I see Tim, but all right.
Okay. Do you want to do what you got one you got one you tagged? Just we can go there.
No, that's okay if you want to.
Okay, I'll read Tim's. It sounds like you wish you could provide more for your kids' college. You buy lottery tickets and imagine winning the lottery and having the money to support them. Does buying the tickets help you feel like you may be able to support them?
Right. So let's go through them one by one. And since I don't have it here on my screen, let me see. I'll move my screen up. Maybe that's the key.
I can mark it for
Here's
you
Tim.
too.
Okay, I've got it.
Okay.
All right. So criterion number 1, identify the conflict. It sounds like you wish you could provide more for your kids' college, right? So there's a conflict there. You wish you could provide more. Name the implicit or explicit fantasy. You buy lottery tickets and imagine, so here's the fantasy, winning the lottery and having the money to support them. So nicely done naming the fantasy. And then 3, ask if the fantasy resolves the conflict. Does buying the tickets help you feel like you may be able to support them? Here, I just might tweak it a bit, Tim. I might say about the fantasy, does actually seeing them, going to college, does that resolve the conflict for you, the conflict of not having the money? The way you framed it works very well with the kind of very conscious desire to buy the lottery tickets. It feels like a plan, right? Buying the tickets concretely might help you feel like you could support them. So it's more like a plan than a fantasy. The fantasy would be actually seeing them perhaps in college, that this is worked, right? Or you've won the lottery. Could you imagine winning the tickets? And that would resolve the conflict. So just a little tweak there to get more into the fantasy than a conscious plan.
Great. Great. Let's go down. I just marked Hannah just marked it one. You can see that San, I think is how you pronounce that person's name, the person's name. You can see I put the little ta-da next to it. Okay. So you're struggling to have enough money to send your kids to college, and you wish you had enough money. So you imagine your kids with their caps and gowns and start to buy the lottery ticket, hoping to get lucky. Did picturing your kids relieve you a bit from the money struggle?
Right, exactly. So you've really named the fantasy and focused on imagining seeing them in their caps and gowns. So I would say, yes, you met the criteria 1, 2, and 3. And so we would say here you're exploring fantasy according to this exercise.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's a good one just because it really, the caps and gowns, the kind of the going with the imagery or creating, in that case, like, sort of giving some imagery that really helps to kind of bring this to the surface. Now, there's one, if you look above it, Hannah, George from Berkeley, if you look above it, I think this one does a really nice job of just naming the conflict. And so I want to read that one over.
Please.
So you have a conflict between wanting to send your kid to college, but you don't make enough money at your job. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, so you have a wish that when you buy the 25 lottery tickets each week, that you feel lucky enough to make that money. And then you picture your kids in caps and gowns graduating and happy. Does that image help you feel less conflicted?
Right, right. Yeah, I like it a lot. I love the explicitness, right? You picture your kids in the caps and gowns, graduating and happy. Does that image help you feel less conflicted? I think for someone who's more psychologically minded, framing it in the conflict might work wonderfully. But I think if they're not so sophisticated, actually naming what the resolution is might be more successful.
Naming what the resolution is. So can you just make it clear what then? So what would that look like? What the resolution is?
Right. Does that image of seeing them so happy really make you feel proud and like you were a success?
Mm.
Right. So that resolves, it's just said in more in the vernacular and more very specifically to the resolution, right? Which is, oh, this person doesn't feel like they're successful enough in life to earn the money to send their kids to college, right? And here it's like, oh, now you're a success.
Mm. Very nice. Okay, great. Let's move to the next one.
Do you want to look at
Sure, we can. Which one do you want to
possible?
look at?
No, the possible therapist response?
Yes, thank you for reminding me. Okay, why don't you read it? Why don't you go ahead and read it, Hannah?
Okay. You want so much to give your kids a good education, but don't see how you'll afford it. So you are imagining winning the lottery and watching your kids graduate college. Would that feel to you like a great accomplishment in your life, seeing them in their caps and gowns?
Great. Wonderful. Okay. Moving along. Practice number 2. Mr. Johnson, he is a 72-year-old depressed widower with 4 grown children. He comes in meek and he says, my doctor said that you'd know how to solve my problems. There's so many. I've seen lots of brilliant doctors on TV. You know, I had a premonition that you'd be like one of them. We'll give you a minute to respond. I think we're good to start here, Hannah. You good?
Yep.
Okay, I just marked one. Actually, let me take that one away. Just let's go with Hannah Jones. I'm going to mark that one.
Okay.
Okay. So Hannah says, as the therapist here, Hannah says, you're feeling overwhelmed by many problems. You're hoping someone brilliant, like maybe me, will be able to solve them. Does imagining that I might be brilliant, the brilliant doctor who knows how to solve your many problems, help you to feel some hope?
Well, that's lovely. That's
Yeah.
lovely. So you've identified the conflict very clearly. And I love how you've just stated the fantasy, right? And then finally asking if the fantasy resolves the conflict, right? Does imagining that I'll be the brilliant doctor who knows how to solve your many problems help you feel some hope?
Yeah. And
Excellent.
hope is a really good word. It really seems to match with kind of with this particular prompt.
Right. With the whole fantasy idea. Right. Excellent. Yeah.
Let's go
And
with
and
go
I love
ahead.
how it just flows. This gives me the opportunity to say here that we give 15 of these examples in the book for each skill. So, and they get a little more difficult as the 15 go on. But you could imagine by the time you get to the 15th one, you're kind of saying it with more ease. There's some verbal fluency. You're making it in your language, maybe with your voice, your emphasis. And that's exactly what we're hoping will happen here with the people, particularly the trainees who are learning this skill, which is at first, it sounds kind of clunky. You know, you're kind of following very closely the words, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But by the time you get to the 10th, 11th, 12th time, you're kind of in the flow of it, right? And making it your own. And I think that's a lovely way to really reassure people who are concerned, oh, we're making technicians out of our students. This is going to make them robots, you know, in saying 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And in actuality, I think it really helps the trainees, as well as experienced therapists, find their own voice. So I particularly like this repetitive, deliberate rehearsal that then becomes your own. So this lovely response of Hannah's gives me the chance to say that.
Right. Okay, let's take a look at Everett's. I just marked it. It sounds like you're struggling with a lot in your life right now. It sounds like you're wishing for me to come in with the expertise to be able to help with all of these struggles. I wonder if that premonition gives you the hope that you will feel better.
Right, right. Again, I think for someone who's psychologically minded, framing it in terms of a premonition that gives you the hope of feeling better, I think would work beautifully. With someone like Mr. Johnson, I'll just say he's become a character in our book. We use him in several different exercises, and we do that intentionally so that the reader will begin to formulate kind of what Mr. Johnson is like. Who is this character in the book? And we've done that with several other personas that we've used, these characters, because in psychodynamic psychotherapy, it is not, as you well know, a one-size-fits-all. In many of the other books, there are no characters that get identified. It's kind of like, here's the client, and they're a stand-in for any other client. But in psychodynamic, because the understanding of what you might do for patient A is not the same thing you do for patient B, even with the same skill, then this now gets into the nuanced aspects, the richness of psychodynamic psychotherapy as an orientation. So here, I think this intervention would meet all of the criteria nicely. And as you would get to know Mr. Johnson and how non-psychologically minded he is, and how he struggles with higher order inferences and things that are not very concretely described, here might be a place that you might get feedback. Well, for Mr. Johnson in particular, how might you say this? So just to add on that other aspect.
Yeah. And when I'm working with my trainees doing deliberate practice, it's the same thing. You know, we'll watch a video of a client session, and I'll say, yeah, you know, we'll pick a skill to work on, and then we'll lay out the criteria, and then the trainee will go and practice it. Now, the first practice one, it's going to be less fluent, like, you know, it's going to be kind of choppy. And then as we, you know, we'll get it to be less fluent in multiple repetitions of the same skill, the same prompt. And also we're going to gear it more towards the individual. So that's what Hannah just did. And that's why this really mirrors, it's nice to see, this really mirrors what deliberate practice looks like, which is as a group, we're beginning to form a clearer picture of what would be the right intervention of exploring fantasy with Mr. Johnson. So that's really well said, Hannah. Okay, let's look at one more here. Let's look at.
And we look at Jacqueline's.
Yeah, for sure. Let me find it. Yes, I'm going to mark that one. Jacqueline's, go for it. Why don't you read it?
Right, and Jacqueline sent in two parts. So the first part is you imagine your doctor being one of the brilliant doctors on TV, right? And then, does this give you some hope? And here I might say, I think this exercise would work better if you started off naming the conflict. So can you identify the conflict between the patient's present circumstances and what they want? And to have them explicitly say that as part of the criteria. Then you imagine your doctor. So we're on to criterion 2. And then criterion 3, ask if it resolves the conflict. So in actual practice, if I were giving you feedback, Jacqueline, I might say, you did great on 2 of the 3 criteria. Could you go back and could we do it again? And this time include criterion number 1. And then I would repeat the whole statement from Mr. Johnson, and we'd repeat it again. Again, that is not a problem. That is not you've done it wrong. It's just another opportunity to go back and redo it in a way that's going to fulfill the criteria.
Yeah. And we just pick out one, Hannah, just that you where you see the conflict really, kind of out of the other responses. Where do you see the conflict brought to, written?
Right. Well, let's say even the one above by Everett. It sounds like you're struggling with a lot in life right now, right? So there's the struggle.
Mhm.
There's the you wish you were better, but you're not. You have a lot of problems. You wish you weren't. It's not quite explicitly dotting every I, but clearly the struggle represents a conflict. And I would say that would be naming it. And then it sounds like you're wishing for me to come in, right? So there's the fantasy. You are explicitly wishing for me to come in. I'm wondering, and then we have that premonition. Yeah. So I think that nicely exemplifies the struggle.
Yeah. Okay, let's get one more because we've got about 18 minutes. So let's get one more. There's a really good question here regarding criteria 3 that I'd actually like to just save until the questions and answers, just so we can get to one more here. So let me read the therapist response real quick. Criterion 1, you are burdened by your many problems and have not been able to solve them on your own. Criterion 2, you had a sense that I would be like one of those brilliant TV doctors. Criterion 3, so you are hoping that I will be able to solve your problems. Great. Okay, so let's move on to one more. The context is a 35-year-old patient and is recently divorced with custody of 2 children. Patient comes in worried. The divorce was okay, but now I fear I'll be alone a long time. Except a new person just moved in next door that seems really nice. I could imagine we could really hit it off. Okay, let's jump in here, Anna.
Yep.
Let's do Vesla's. After your divorce, you have been alone for a long time, and now you see this nice person has moved in next door. Do you see that person as the answer to your wishes?
Right. Yes. You've been alone for a long time. So that is the implicit conflict there. And now you see that a nice person has moved in next door, right? And the other part that I might just add is this imagining, right? That ooh, not just a nice person next door, but actually I could form a relationship with this nice person next door, right? So just that added bit there, which is the potential resolution of this imagined conflict. Do you see that person as the answer to your wishes? Right. So see if that could resolve the conflict of being alone and lonely.
Great. Okay, you want to pick one out here?
Let's see.
Got a lot of good ones.
All right. Well, you pick one, Jason.
All right, let's go with Lay's. Mark, you just got a divorce and feel worried about being alone. Then you seem hopeful to hit it off with your new neighbor and build connections with them. I wonder if this vision helps you to feel less alone and more hopeful about the future.
Oh, this one is just exemplary.
Yeah, it really packs.
I like this one very much, right? So you've got the conflict in there. You feel worried about being alone, just got divorced, right? And then you could hit it off with this new neighbor. You could build connections with them. There's the fantasy, right? And then I wonder if this vision of what could happen helps you feel less alone, more hopeful about the future. Yeah, exactly. Very nice.
Great. Okay, let's go with Jaren. I'm going to mark it here. You are afraid that you will be alone for a long time, and you imagine starting a relationship with a new person next door. Does imagining a life together make you feel less fearful of being alone?
Right. Also an excellent response, right? There's the conflict. You're afraid, You'll be alone for a long time. Then you imagine this person. And does imagining a life together with this new person make you feel less fearful, resolving the conflict? Excellent. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. And the way you read it kind of filled in the gaps there. Really helpful. You got
I love, obviously people in here attending are really experienced therapists. I love, how the verbiage just flows. It doesn't seem awkward or stilted. And so really, I think it nicely shows how these skills could be implemented, not sound stilted, not sound forced in the give and take. And of course, I do want to say one other thing before we leave the skills for today. No one is expecting that in dealing with a patient's fantasies, for example, it's going to be done 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It may take a whole session to really fill this out, to take it each step. But once you have the 1, 2, 3 in your mind, once that enables you to see things and where you might go, yes, of course, then you can match it very much to what's going on in the session, slow it down, make it uniquely theirs. But in your mind, you have the 1, 2, 3. So again, we're not looking to perform this exactly, but really that it enables us to have an idea about how we could handle the possibility of a fantasy or a daydream.
Great. All right, let's take a look on it. You want to read the therapist response here?
Sure, although I love the ones in the chat. You see yourself as alone and lonely. Suddenly, a new, really nice person appears on the scene, and in your mind's eye, you see the two of you together. Perhaps this person could be the answer to your loneliness. You'll see in this example here that I don't make it explicit about the fantasy. I don't say this fantasy is the answer to your loneliness, so that you're using this fantasy. I kind of, and this is just stylistic, I just kind of go with, so perhaps this person could be the answer to your loneliness. I kind of join them in that fantasy so we could deepen it.
Wonderful. Okay, let me stop the share here. And if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, that'd be great. If you want to put it in the chat, that's good too. I'm not going to pronounce his name right. I'm sorry, San. I'm not sure if I got it, but there is a question here regarding criteria 3. And how do you understand the idea of resolve the conflict? Clearly, daydreaming does not resolve an actual conflict, even though it might be nice to take a break from reality. And then she makes a winky emoji there, or they make a winky emoji. So, what do you hear in that question, Hannah?
Well, I think the end part of the question actually is answering the question in my mind, which is, of course, fantasy doesn't actually resolve the problem, right? That's otherwise we'd call it planning. We'd call it setting up procedures to get things accomplished in your life, but it clearly does not ultimately resolve the conflict, but it does give you a break. It does for that time being. Oh, I could hit it off with this person who just moved in. Seems like a great person. Wouldn't that be wonderful? For that moment, maybe a day or two, or maybe I stay infatuated for a week. I carry that fantasy around. That gives me a break from the reality, right? And that's one of the things that would distinguish it from, I'm so sorry. That's one of the things that would distinguish it, from making a plan or what have you. It gives you a momentary break.
Yeah. Yeah. People raise your hands, please, and I'll stop myself in terms of asking questions. But that actually sparked a question. The very first, so George's response, in the very first response he gave, does that image help you feel less conflicted? And that made me think about, what's the point here? Are we helping people to feel less conflicted? Is that what we're going for? And I mean, so yeah, does that make sense, that question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I mean, what's the point here? Are we helping people to feel more conflicted? Are we helping them to be more with their fantasy? I mean,
Yeah.
what's the deal
So
here?
again, it so depends on where that particular patient is. With some patients, I think getting into daydreams, not even calling them fantasies, which can feel a little threatening, oh, I'd love to hear about your fantasies.
Mhm.
But more talking about daydreams, it's a way to help people who aren't accustomed to thinking about their rich inner life begin to see they do have a rich inner life. And,
Mm.
and in this way, kind of gently move them into considering the role that fantasy, that daydreams, that dreaming could play in helping them understand what is going on for them at the present time? Where
Mm.
are the conflicts? What are the resolutions? What are the things they're not paying attention to as they're imagining, these kind of fanciful resolutions, if you will.
Mhm.
So it gives an entree into understanding one's rich inner life, which, of course, those of us who practice psychodynamic psychotherapy so appreciate about the model.
Right. And really distinguishes the model, right? I mean, from other models
Yeah.
is this the unconscious process and dreams and fantasies and metaphors as we described, as we talked about in the last webinar, that this is really where psychodynamic psychotherapy really differentiates itself.
Right, right. And of course, it could get quite sophisticated in terms of transference and countertransference, projective identification. What is the wish that the patient hopes you will be, right? And then, in a way, in the give and take of the relationship, actually might get you to behave in a way that's in accordance with that wish.
Mm.
And we might think of that as a reenactment, and then how to work your way out of that. So this whole idea about we're thinking about fantasy could go from the very mundane, you are having a daydream, all the way up to something very complicated about what's happening between patient and therapist.
Yeah. And just a comment here. I mean, today's webinar really, one thing it really made me appreciate is the way that the exercises demystify psychodynamic psychotherapy. I mean, the idea of working with fantasy is, I mean, it's challenging. It's hard to think about, but just to watching, I was smiling a little bit to myself just watching as people were really just kind of, this is one way that you can really work with fantasy with your clients or patients. So it really demystified it for me today. I appreciate
And let
that.
me just say, because that is a particular bent of mine, the whole, I think, contemporary psychodynamic relational movement is moving toward a more practical, pragmatic, recognizable, everyday language way of understanding these complexities that go on psychodynamically, that we don't need to have these third order inferences or these concepts that even the experts can't quite agree on. We can really, kind of concretize and anchor these very important interactions and interventions that we do in things that are recognizable, not only to ourselves and our colleagues, but also our patients. So I find that really opening up so many aspects, more conversational form, if you will, of psychodynamic psychotherapy.
Great. Yeah. Cool. Any thoughts you got, Hannah, about today, or just reflections on the responses that people gave?
Oh, I love the responses and the creativity of them, and again the kind of verbal fluency of them. Very much enjoyed being with you today. Thank you.
And Dr. Huang says, thank you so much. Gratitude from Allison. Thank you guys for that. I put in the chat some links. Stay tuned for future webinars. And it's been fun. Thank you all so much for for your time and your participation and your hard work today. So see you in the next go around. Thanks again, Hannah.
You're welcome. Lovely being with you. Bye.
This webinar is made possible by the Sentio Marriage and Family Therapy Program. Visit us at www.sentio.org.